Well, Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene is one of the most important works of visionary literature in the English canon. And since this is not just a course about enchantment or the poetics of enchantment or visionary literature, it's also a survey of English literary history to be able to get a bird's eye view of not just the visionary tradition in England, but also some of the major developments of English poetry. So, congratulations to everyone who started, and those of you who have even finished book one of the Faerie Queene. It's tough. It's a rite of passage, though, for many poetry readers, just to be engaging with these ideas and hearing the beautiful poetry. And I know many of you were listening to it or reading it aloud, and that's exactly how the poetry should be enjoyed. So we've come to week 6 in our course, the Poetics of Enchantment, and we've surveyed so far philosophers, some theologians, some poets, mystics, high Arthurian romance writers, and these were all of the classical and medieval periods. But now we're in a different category of literature. So from the Roman Catholic 15th century England, we now turn to the Protestant 16th century English literature. It's a little different. So we've arrived at what is often called the Renaissance, which happened during the Protestant Reformation and coincides with it. And we're also in the early modern period, which follows in its wake. So now we're moving into the more modern period. Let me show you an image of our poet. Here's an alleged uh, portrait of Spenser. Uh, this may have been him. He would have dressed that way. Spenser is uh, like uh, like Milton, like Shakespeare, one of the visionary poets. And I want to show you a quotation by Harold Bloom that I've mentioned before on this channel. He says that Spenser, like Milton after him, is a Protestant poet, and the Spenserian tradition in English poetry has been a Protestant one, with a progressive movement to what could be called the visionary left wing, radical in politics, individualist in religion, and insisting upon the unsupported imagination as its own warrant. And I think to really understand the visionary aspect of Spenser, the first step is to understand um, what it means to be a visionary poet. So, in what sense is Spenser a visionary poet? What even is a visionary poet? And how does Spenser push this tradition of visionary literature forward in a way that would significantly influence every major chapter of English literary history to follow? And that's what this lecture is going to be about today. So let me bring us back to Edmund Spenser. He's often called the poet's poet. He was born in London in 1552. He was educated at the Merchant Taylors' School before attending Cambridge University, and it's there where his literary career began. He publishes The Shepherd's Calendar in 1579, and this was a pastoral poem on every month of the year, and it it lived up to the very Puritan classical taste that was popular in Cambridge in the in the 1570s. There was Puritanism, and they were really interested in kind of classical and correct style poetry. And this poem really fulfills it. But his great work is the Faerie Queene. Spenser went on to serve in Ireland as a colonial administrator, where he composed The Faerie Queene, which was published in 1590 and then published again in 1596. And this is an epic celebrating Elizabethan nationalism and Elizabethan Protestantism, Protestant virtue. It's very, very, very religious in that way. So Spenser's life is marked by this dual role as a poet and an English settler in Ireland, where he also participated in the brutality of Elizabethan expansion in Ireland. Spenser is a bad name in Ireland, and I think rightly so, because he was part of that colonizing of the Elizabethan expansion project. So that's something I mention because it's there and it often comes up when folks are talking about Spenser, and it's good to know. So Spenser, just to locate him in history, he's a contemporary of William Shakespeare, Sir Philip Sidney, Mary Sidney Herbert, whom we've read, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and Sir Walter Raleigh. So that's really one of the most productive periods in English literature is the Renaissance and the post-Renaissance movement, early modernism. Edmund Spenser, William Shakespeare, and John Milton are sometimes considered the literary trinity of the English canon. If you were to boil everything down to three, I think those are the three that most scholars would agree are the most important, the fathers of a certain tradition, not only were they important for the modernists, Milton less so, but they were also important for the Romantics and the 18th century and the Restoration period. But what makes Spenser so special as a visionary poet in the English tradition? And in this course, in the syllabus, I've described the word visionary as indicating this heightened sense of perception, a intuition, or an insight into this interdependent, spiritual, sometimes mystical aspect of human life and nature. And the visionary tradition in literature is one that imagines and communicates this awareness, a sensitivity to other realities, spiritual, divine, animal, that pulses beneath the awareness of human existence. And to the answer to Spenser's singularity as a poet lies in this great work that we read, the Faerie Queene, particularly its use of the allegory, which we're all familiar with at this point. It's visionary in the sense that, like Plato's allegory of the cave, it makes a complex spiritual and intellectual journey visible through metaphors and symbols, and its metaphors are usually visual. So there's this very important letter to Sir Walter Raleigh that Edmund Spenser writes on the 23rd of January, 1589. And here's a portion of it. He says, Sir, knowing how doubtfully all allegories may be construed in this book of mine, which I have entitled The Faerie Queene, being a continued allegory or dark conceit, I have thought good to discover unto you the general intention and meaning. The general end, therefore, of all the book is to fashion a gentleman or noble person in virtuous and gentle discipline. Just to break from the text here, he's definitely within the humanism of Sir Philip Sidney, who also believes that good literature leads to better moral conduct. So he's within this Renaissance humanistic tradition of valuing literature for its moral ends. And we saw William Caxton valuing Malory for the same reasons. Which for that I conceived should be most plausible and pleasing, being coloured with an historical fiction, the which the most part of men delight to read, rather for variety of matter than for profit of the ensample. I chose the history of King Arthur, as most fit for the excellency of his person. So there are two senses of the word allegory here, as Gordon Teskey explains in his entry in the Spenser Encyclopedia. Now, this is probably the greatest resource you could possibly buy on Spenser studies. If you're going to buy any book, you should buy this giant book, which is just a treasury of, it's the only book you'll ever need on Spenser. If you only have one, this is it. It's absolutely incredible. It's a work of it's kind of miraculous, actually. So Gordon Teskey has an interesting, it's all alphabetized by topic and by name. And one of the categories here is allegory. And Gordon Teskey writes a very long entry on allegory in this book, which is probably one of the best things you can read on allegory, I think. So in this entry, he says many things. One of the things he explains right at the beginning is the two senses of the word allegory. And there's the rhetorical sense, when Quintilian describes allegory as an extended metaphor. And in this sense, it's a rhetorical trope or a turn, a phrase. The phrase "life is a highway" is a metaphor. That song itself is a continued metaphor. It's engaging in this rhetorical use of the metaphor, one thing for something else. And that's what you call a conceit, from which we get the word concept. So when Spenser, when he's talking to Raleigh, when he's writing to Raleigh, he calls the allegory a dark conceit. What he means is it's dark, hidden, mysterious concept. And it's actually got several concepts that are darkly and mysteriously nestled into this narrative. Hello, everyone. If you're enjoying this lecture and you'd like to join the live classrooms and the discussions, then you can sign up to study literature with me at Versed, an online community where readers study poetry and take classes together. It's inspired by the university lecture hall and discussion model, and this is where I host my live courses, my live lectures, book clubs, seminar discussions, and more, all with an open door policy. No pressure, no cold calls, and no snobbery. Just serious people who love literature in a friendly space. Every few months or so, we vote on our next courses and reading groups, so as a member, you can help us decide what we'll read next. And when you do join, you'll get access to the live discussions that are happening now, all the past courses, all the discussion rooms, the chat rooms, the special Q&A sessions that I sometimes host, and the office hours with me, where you can talk about your latest readings. You'll even find space to share some of your own poetry if you're a poet yourself, a place where you can workshop poetry with other poets who practice the craft. It's a great place to find community with other readers and other poets. So if you'd like to join us, check out the link below. And now, back to the lecture. So that's one sense, is the rhetorical sense of allegory, an extended metaphor. But then there's this other sense. And when Julian of Norwich went on at the length of a paragraph, to liken the soul to a city, she was verging on the allegorical in the second sense. When she said that she saw all that was made resting in the palm of her hand, the size of a hazelnut, she's verging on the allegorical mode. Let me show you that excerpt from Teskey's entry. Because Spenser's phrase, continued allegory or dark conceit, recapitulates traditional ideas of allegory that are in themselves in need of critical analysis, it should be taken not as an objective description of the poem before us, but rather as an indication of how the poet would like us to respond. Spenser is not telling us how to classify his poem. He's telling us how to enjoy it. And there's something he recognizes, that allegory, there's this enjoyment that we get from it. Even with Plato, I mean, I remember our discussion on Plato was just so lively and dynamic because we were essentially enjoying and playing the dynamic, playing with the dynamic allegory itself. That's what Spenser expects us to do here. The allegories work on several levels. It's never just a one-to-one ratio. I'll explain what I mean. Spenser actually explains himself to Raleigh what he means. He says that in that Faerie Queene, in the figure of the Faerie Queene, I mean glory in my general intention, but in my particular I conceive the most excellent and glorious person of our sovereign the Queen, it's Queen Elizabeth, and her kingdom in fairyland. And yet, in some places else, I do otherwise shadow her. And the first of the Knight of the Red Cross, in whom I express holiness. So he's going down and breaking down the allegorical relations of the characters, but what's interesting is diversity by which the allegory can work on multiple levels. So we've got a political reading of the Queen. Faerie Queene Gloriana, who appears in later books, is Queen Elizabeth on a political level. But Una, who means the one true faith, singularity, represents many things. An institution, such as the Church of England at some times. It's truth itself. It's also representative of all of us. She's a descendant, really, of Adam and Eve, as we find. and her parents are endangered by a dragon, mirroring the sort of Christian anthropology, the idea that the first parents were tricked by a serpent or a dragon. And the same thing's going on there. So she's working on that level as well. And then Red Cross Knight simply is holiness. But he's also at times Saint George from the story Saint George and the Dragon, which is a very English story of how Saint George came and rescued England from a dragon in a similar way that Saint Patrick rescued Ireland by banishing snakes. So we've got some levels here of allegory, not just a one-to-one ratio of real figures, but also virtues, institutions, concepts. And I think this is part of the enduring vitality of Spenser because you can do a lot with that and it speaks on many different levels. So he talks as well about his form and why he starts in medias res. For the method of the poet historical is not such as of an historiographer. For an historiographer discourseth of affairs orderly as they were done, accounting as well the times as the actions, but a poet thrusts into the midst, even where it most concerneth him, and there recoursing to the things forepast and divining of things to come, making a pleasing analysis of all. Not interested in giving us a history. And this is slightly different from Mallory, who begins in the beginning. As a chronicler, he's actually quite different as a romance writer because he doesn't start in the middle. He starts at the beginning and tells the entire history of Arthur in a romantic way. But Spenser's not doing that. He engages right in the middle of things. And here's the first stanza, Canto 1, Book 1. And beside it I have stanza 4, which describes Una. A gentle knight was pricking on the plain, he clad in mighty arms and silver shield, wherein old dents of deep wounds did remain, the cruel marks of many a bloody field. Yet arms till that time did he never wield. His angry steed did chide his foaming bit, as much disdaining to the curb to yield. Full jolly knight he seemed, and fair did sit, as one for knightly jousts and fierce encounters fit. Really great description, really great beginning. And then we have this beautiful description of Una, who's riding behind. A lovely lady rode him fair beside him. A lovely lady rode him fair beside, upon a lowly ass more white than snow. Yet she much whiter, for the same did hide under a veil that wimpled was full low. What a lovely line just to stop there. Under a veil that wimpled was full low. It's just so musical in the Elizabethan way. And over all a black stole did she throw, as one that inly mourned. So was she sad, and heavy sat upon her palfrey slow. Seemed in heart some hidden care she had, and by her in a line a milk-white lamb she had. She lad, that is to lead. I'm going to talk about the archaic diction here, because this is not how Spenser speaks. He's trying to make it sound older. Right here, let me just draw your attention to a great invention of Spenser's, and that's the Spenserian stanza. This is partly how my friend who walked in the office knew exactly that I was reading Spenser's Faerie Queene, because she was able to recognize the way the lines looked on the page. You can tell. It's 9 lines with rhymes that correspond A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C. I have these colored here so you can see how the rhyme scheme works out. Very interwoven. We might even say interlaced rhymes. What's something we notice about the rhymes? One is that it has 2 couplets, field and wheeled right there in the middle, sit and fit there at the end. Same thing over here. The rhyme scheme's perfect all throughout. couplet here, and a couplet at the end. Each line is made of iambic pentameter, which is the way Shakespeare wrote, which is really the way Chaucer wrote, and it most suits the English diction and rhythm. Iambic pentameter means that each line contains 10 syllables, and every other syllable is stressed. In English, we stress some words and not others. Uh, my name, Adam, has the stress on the first syllable. Frederick, stress on the first syllable. Alexandra, that's different. That's got the stress on the third syllable. Alexandra. So it all depends on where the English puts the stress, and each line counts the stress. A lovely lady rode him fair beside. That's the iambic pentameter. And penta means five, so you've got five stressed syllables, and iambic is that regulation. Every other syllable is stress. A lovely lady rode him fair beside. Now, with one exception, the final line is not iambic pentameter. It has an extra syllable. We can't say extra because it's supposed to be there. It's a line of hexameter. It's got 6 feet. So instead of 5, you have just a slightly longer line here at the end. And by her in a line a milk-white lamb she lad. And the effect is really, really intricate. If you were to go through the book, as I was doing this time, I was rereading it and thinking of the different ways he's able to manipulate the turns of the stanza. How the middle couplet often yields a really great place to slightly turn and adjust one's perspective or one's attention, or to introduce a new idea. In this case, introducing the new character, the angry steed, at the conclusion of this couplet. Couplets give a good sense of finality. So it makes sense that at the end of the 9-line Spenserian stanza, you'd have another couplet. But in order to make it really shut close and to feel like it's got a sense of conclusion, you've got that extra, uh, foot there at the end to kind of give it a nice concluding thud. And each one has this nice containment that way. And I think too that the rhymes tend to incline a bit to make you expect an ending. They incline towards a rhyme, of course. The A's are completed here within the first 3 lines, but the B rhymes are evenly distributed throughout. They kind of rise up to the couplet in the middle and then fall away just as the new rhyme is introduced. Bit, sit, and we're expecting the end, and we get it with that last metrical snap. That's how the Spenserian stanza works. Now, why was Spenser so archaic? Because these spellings are very Mallorean, they're very Chaucerian, they're very Middle English. So Spenser deliberately writes this way. And the poem is difficult enough for contemporary readers, but having this archaic spelling, and sometimes these archaic words like eclad, was clad, it's the past tense clad, or covered or dressed, gives it this sense of very old. And I think this is part of the enchanting effect. Spenser is one of the poets where he's really trying to get you to feel a certain way about what you're reading. He wants you to, it's like a new church that's built in an old style. It wants you to feel like you're in an old space when you're not. That's the way Spenser wants the poem to work on you. And C.S. Lewis has a great quotation from his essay on reading the Faerie Queene. He writes, "For this is the great paradox of Spenser's poem. It is not really medieval. No medieval romance is very like it. Yet, everyone who has really enjoyed is from the Wartons down, has enjoyed it as a very consummation of the Middle Ages, the quintessence of the black letter flavor. such as we had in Malory. He has become something of the last of the medieval poets and the first of the romantic medievalists. So kind of like Regina was bridging the worlds between the West and the East, the Greek and the Latin, so Spenser is also bridging these two worlds of the medieval past, whose time has come to a close, and the modern present as its beginning. So that's the Spenserian stanza. That's a little bit about the style. Uh, it's a very dynamic form, although nobody does it quite like Spenser. Other poets have tried, many poets have tried to write in Spenserian stanza, try to bring it back, but it never quite really works. I think the best poet to do it was the 18th century Scottish poet James Beattie. He has a poem called The Minstrel that's really beautiful, and it's written in Spenserian stanzas. Wordsworth tried it, but I don't think Wordsworth is really that great at it. His medium is the blank verse of Milton, but he tries it out, as many poets have. So let's talk a little bit about interlacement. So the story starts in the middle of things, but we also have the interlacement that we saw with the Romance style in Malory. People are crisscrossing back and forth. But in the letter to Sir Walter Raleigh, Spenser says, I do start in the beginning, and I have good reason to do so, but here's the backstory. So what happens before the Faerie Queene? He says, at the beginning of the feast, there's this tall, awkward, young man, and he comes up to the queen. As, according to custom, he asks her a boon for her to grant him a wish. And she accepts, and he says, well, I want to have my choice at whatever adventure arises during this feast. And so he sits on the floor because he doesn't have a good seat. He's young, he's awkward. And shortly after, a young lady comes in mourning weeds, wearing her black, riding a white donkey, with a dwarf following, and she's leading a war horse. Nobody's on it. And on the war horse is a pile of armor. She comes before the Queen of Fairies and says, she pleads for help. There's a dragon that has overtaken her father and mother, and it won't let them escape. So she begs the queen to give her one of her knights to fight the dragon and to restore her family. Well, immediately overhearing this, the young man rises up and says, let me go. I want, this is the quest I want. And the queen everyone's kind of astonished at first. The lady protests, but he persists. And at last she said, well, you have to wear the armor that she brought. And so he puts on the armor, and Spenser says that the armor is symbolic of the Bible because of that passage in Ephesians where Paul says, what does he say? Put on the full armor of God. Yeah. And he's got the shield and the sword, and they all symbolize something. It's a very allegorical moment in this letter to the Ephesians. So that's what Spenser has in mind. And so this young man puts on the armor, and he suddenly looks better than everyone in the room. And everyone approves, including the lady, who is a little uncertain of this young man. So he's given knighthood. He gets on the war horse, and he rides forth. And that's why he's so young, and that's why the angry steed is chiding at the foaming bit, because he perhaps feels too good to be ridden by this young knight. But I think this is interesting because I think the significance of this is that Red Cross Knight is a symbol of the Protestant faith, which is still very young and still very awkward and doesn't quite have a chair at the feast. He's new to the scene, and he must prove his mettle. And I think for English Protestantism in particular, it had this inferiority complex. It was awkward. It was still trying to figure out. It had yet to really be tested in a real way, or it was still continuing to be tested, both in word and abroad. So that's another level that's working here with the backstory. Now, in the Spenser Encyclopedia that I recommended to you, there is also an entry on romance written by Patricia Parker. And she outlines how this story engages with several kinds of quest narratives. And two are really important for us. The first is the biblical quest, the quest to recover Eden. So Una's parents are king and queen ruling over a kingdom threatened by a dragon. And we learn at the end of book 1 in Canto 12 that their kingdom is called Eden. And it's only then where Spenser gives us that. So we put it together in retrospect, thinking, oh, this is a quest to recover what was lost in Eden. So we're in that allegorical space until the second Adam reverses the first Adam's curse. It's that whole typological thing. So in some way, the Red Cross Knight represents Christ, but he also represents the Christian everyman or every woman, every person, this kind of stand-in place. The critics who don't like Spenser will usually say that his characters are kind of flat. And I think that's owing to the allegory. But there's the other sense of the biblical quest of wandering in the wilderness that the Hebrews experienced after their enslavement from Egypt. I feel like the English church is having a moment where, okay, they've rejected Catholicism, and I'll talk a little bit about the Reformation in a moment, but they've rejected European Roman Catholicism, and now they're in this liminal space. The forest in Spenser's allegory is also a liminal space, a in-between space of testing and of trial before they come into their own. I think this is what's going on with our Red Cross Knight as well. The second quest tradition is the one that we think of when we hear the word quest narrative. We think of Sir Thomas Malory's Quest for the Grail, or the Parzival, the Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival Quest for the Grail. It's the romance where you have these interlacing quests and missions that crisscross, intersect, and sometimes run parallel to each other. It's like in Malory, how Lancelot is always going around rescuing people from bullies. There's always an adventure going on. And so that's the second sense of the quest narrative that I think is really important here. That's the allegorical element. For the last section here, I want to look at the visionary Protestant element that Bloom introduced us to. This is going to be, I think, important for many of the works we'll be continuing in our course. So let's consider the Protestant Reformation briefly. It began in the early 16th century. It sought to reform the Catholic Church by emphasizing faith, that salvation is through faith and not, you can't pay your way out of purgatory. We don't need the mediation of a pope. What we need is the authority of Scripture to be above the priests and the popes. So it's a purification mission. But very quickly, the Roman Catholic Church proved itself pretty resistant to reform. And so those who wanted to reform it broke off into their own sect, Protestantism. It is a protest movement, protestism. And it's protesting papal supremacy, basically. So the English have their own. They make the head of the English Church the English monarchy, not the Pope. And in England, it works out differently in different countries, but in England, the Reformation worked out in a way that bridged really extreme Puritan ideology and sought to find a middle way between Puritanism and Roman Catholicism. And what they wound up keeping were bishops and grand churches and ideas of the sacrament, although that was changed and renovated to some degree. But this meant that all the monasteries were dissolved. King Henry VIII gave the monasteries to his aristocracy and kicked all the monks and nuns out. So it was a tough time for a lot of people. But when Elizabeth came to the throne after such chaos, she wanted to do the middle way, what they called the Elizabethan compromise. Not get rid of everything from the Roman Catholic Church, but salvage what was right, and to not go into the extremism of some other kinds of Protestants, like Puritanism. So the Red Cross Knight is seen as a figure representing English Protestantism on some level. He navigates the extremes of this very ornate Catholicism with trying to find this path forward. But the key trouble for him, and I think Daniel, you mentioned this in the Discord, the key trouble is discerning between appearances of good and evil. And this is the early Protestant anxiety of how how can something be beautiful but also be good? Appearances are deceptive. There's also something really Platonic about that if we go back to the allegory of the cave. Part of the Red Cross Knight's education is that he must distinguish between the forms of goodness and essential goodness. And that's what his whole education is about. Hence the false sorceress Duessa. We have Una, who means the one true religion. Then we have Duessa, who is duplicity, our falsehood. It's actually a really nice pun because she wears a hood. And then I think it's in Canto 4 or 5 where Spenser puns on falsehood. There's lots of puns going on allegorically here. But she also represents false religion. And on a political level, she also kind of represents, some scholars believe, Mary, Queen of Scots, or the Church of Rome. So depending on where she is, these meanings get associated with her. And sometimes in the narrative, the allegorical association will collapse into one and other times expand into many. And it's interesting to trace where the poem does that because it's working on many levels at times. The other enemy is Archimago, who tricks Red Cross Knight into believing that Una was faithless. And so he forsakes Una in the beginning of book 2. Archimago has two things going on in his name. Archmage, or magus, means he's the arch magician. But you've also got archimago, imago, the Latin word for image. So he's the arch image maker, but he's also a magician. And it's really significant that the evil, the enemy, is an image maker. Because one of the great characteristics, one of the important characteristics of the English Reformation was iconoclasm and the debate about images. So when they broke from Rome, the English church had to figure out what was right and what was wrong about the way they had been doing things for hundreds of years. And one of the things they decided was one of the 10 Commandments says that thou shalt not make any graven image of God or anything in heaven. And so some Protestants, mainly Puritans, went around destroying the images of the churches. That's why in England, when you go to an old church, you'll find an empty alcove where it looks like there should be a statue of a person. They've all been removed and broken because there's this idea that the vision, the priority of the sense experience of taking in the beautiful form would lead one to idolatry or deception. And there is so much beauty bound up in Roman Catholic aesthetics, especially in the Baroque period, which on some levels was a counter-Reformation artistic movement, which sought to overwhelm the senses with beauty. This is what the English Protestants are afraid of, and that's partly why Archimago is the enemy. This is all going back into this whole fabric of this debate. So, the Archmagus or the Archimago? He's both. And this gets into the Protestant visionary poetics of the Romance. And this isn't to say that this is the right way to read Spenser, because people have been reading Spenser for years, and you don't actually have to enjoy the story to know the historical connections here. But I mention it because it's going to be important when we come to Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. We have another image there, a dangerous image that needs to be legalized, authorized by Leontes. Anyway, so it's all tied to history. Now, on vision, let me show you this quotation, which This is a great plug for the Spencer Encyclopedia. Here we go. Under the Vision article, this is what Thomas Hyde writes. From beginning to end, seeing something in the Faerie Queene causes or marks crucial narrative turns. So we're talking about the priority of vision. The poem draws upon a tradition as old as Plato of figuring acts of cognition and understanding with visual metaphors. Spenser's heroes must learn to see properly in an allegory that works largely by visualizing moral, spiritual, and intellectual issues. The prominence of vision that helped to animate discussions of the rhetorical and mimetic nature of his narrative as well as his pictorialism. So vision is important to his poetics. It's important to his relation to images and the ideal church. And his whole, the way he dramatizes the intellectual development of the Red Cross Knight, which I think we're going to talk more about in discussion on Wednesday for our seminar discussion. So Spenser, he's really interested in making sure that the young Protestant movement is going to grow in the discernment of images between being able to discern between good and false images, between the ornate beautiful that might hide evil and the simple and naive beauty of the good. And when we get to George MacDonald's Fantastes and some other works, including I think Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, we will see this duplicity, this need to uncover the evil that might be behind the beautiful. So the Red Cross Knight forsakes Una, unable to discern true from false, and then through various trials, eventually is made to learn. Now I'm skipping over a lot when I turn to the House of Holiness, which I'm about to do. I want to consider the concept of the otherworld, because in some sense, all of fairyland is this other world. We have the deception, we have this forest, but also the House of Holiness, just like the House of Pride, has this other dimension to it of being another world within an other world. And I'm drawing on that concept I established in Lecture 3 with Rogier, this idea of nature being alive with other places, other energies, other geographies. So the way the Red Cross Knight moves through these worlds, I think mirrors the way Plato in his allegory of the cave represents enlightenment. It's also similar to how Rogier describes the soul's ascent through nature, through contemplation, being able to discern the divine energies from the things. And just like Plato's philosopher must discern the shadows from the figures, and then the figures from the actual people and things, and the light of the fire from the fire, and the fire from the sun. It's this division of being able to discern between these things you're seeing, and that is everything in the Faerie Queene. It's so integral to it. Let me move us to the House of Holiness, just this one canto here. There is an ancient house not far away, renowned throughout the world for sacred lore, and pure unspotted life. So well, they say, it governed was, and guided evermore, through wisdom of a matron gave, grave and hoar, whose only joy was to relieve the needs of wretched souls, and help the helpless poor. All night she spent in bidding of her beads, and all the day in doing good and godly deeds. Beads, her little prayer beads. So this is a good woman praying on her beads. The Old English word for prayer is bead, actually. That's where we get the word bead. So he's tapping into this old religion, which is also very English. This is described, the cantos go on, the stanzas go on, but it's described as this hidden place, this nestled place and seldom sought. I just have a couple more slides to go. But I want to draw your attention to what Coleridge says about this place, and I shared this on the community board before the lecture. Coleridge says, the marvelous interdependence of true imaginative absence of all particular place and time. It is neither in the domains of history or geography. It is ignorant of all artificial boundary, truly in the land of Faerie, that is, in mental space. So Coleridge is making a connection to the fairyland as the human mind. It's very psychological, yes, but it's more than that. As I think you all might be picking up on, especially after Origina, this belief in nature as a means through which divine truth is revealed. This parallels, I think, Spenser's use of the natural and supernatural landscapes of the Faerie Queene. And we saw how Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur is set within a world inhabited by magic, magicians, nature spirits, sorcerers. And in the Faerie Queene, the House of Holiness, for example, functions as a sacred space where Red Cross Knight undergoes this transformation, this moral and spiritual conversion. It really is a conversion moment that readies him to take on the dragon. Well, Erigina's emphasis on intellectual ascent through contemplation does echo this visionary journey. So there are different ways of figuring what's happening within. And what happens to the Red Cross Knight at the end in the House of Holiness? He has this visionary experience. He glimpses the New Jerusalem. So it's almost as if Spenser's broader Protestant framework of spiritual purification apparently leads to a visionary experience. And it's this experience, I think, that gives him the ability to discern between appearances and essences of what looks good and what actually is good. So there's so much more to talk about here, and I'm looking forward to talking about much more in discussion. But for now, I'll stop here, and we will be reading Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale next week. Okay, I'm going to leave the recording running so we can get questions or comments about this allegory. This lecture was pretty like historically heavy compared to what I usually do. But I wanted to establish this connection of it in time because it's a really significant moment in which Spenser comes onto the stage of English poetry. And Shakespeare will as well, literally, with The Winter's Tale, as we'll see next week.